Greetings and bienvenue, MITZU. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I've been meaning to tell this story, but I just haven't gotten around to it. The story begins back in 2012. One of my closest friends lived in a little town named Llano. It was about 40 minutes from where I lived. The town was made up of about 20 houses, a beat-up post office, a jerky store, and a gas station. It was all a little cluster set right at the base of one of the largest mountains of the valley. My friend and I would usually chill at his house, play video games, go hiking, etc. Well, one day my friend, his name is Zach, told me about how his older brother Dave and his friend found an abandoned house up the mountain. Apparently, Dave said it was haunted. Zach asked if I wanted to hike the mountain and find it. Of course I said yes. So we packed some water and flashlights and headed out. After about a 2-hour hike up the mountain, we came to an old dilapidated house. It looked like a decent-sized house, one that was probably grand and noble-looking when it was first built. It was also creepy. All the windows were boarded up, the paint was flaking off, and the house just seemed like it was going to collapse in on itself. Zach and I walked up the creaky old steps of the porch and to the front door. It opened without any resistance, as if the house was begging us to come in. The first thing that we noticed was how dark the inside of the house was. It was about 2 in the afternoon. The sun was shining just fine, yet the house was still so dark. I hesitated at first about entering, but Zach encouraged me to press on. We turned on our flashlights and charged in. The first thing that hit us was how bad it smelled. It was like a mixture of sausage and animal carcass. The second thing I noticed was the main lobby of the house. It looked something like straight out of a cliché, Hollywood scary movie. There was a single table in the middle of the lobby and curved staircase going down each side behind it. In between the archway of the staircases was a large hallway. Zach and I decided to try our luck there. We walked down the hallway until we found a wooden staircase to our left that must have led to the cellar and basement downstairs. Now, I was already freaked out as it was, so I had no intentions of going down those stairs. But my friend Zach coaxed me into it. We took our flashlights and headed down those creaky steps. We were about halfway down the staircase when we heard a loud slam come from the lobby. It was the sound of a door slamming shut, and it caused us to jump. Now, instead of doing the smart thing and getting the hell out, we decided to keep going down the stairs. As the stairs ended, it took us to a small hallway completely made of smooth stone. At the end of it lay one single door. It was one of the scariest things I had ever seen. Zach and I slowly walked to it. We looked at each other and let out a deep breath before opening it. What happened next will forever be burned in my brain. We pushed the door open. Inside was one weak, dead sun ray of light, barely pushing through the dirt and grime of the old window. That light shined on the only piece of furniture in the room, a rocking chair. Now the rocking chair has no significance. It's what sat in the chair, an old woman. Or at least it was the body of an old woman. I looked at Zach and then back at the woman. We both mused aloud that she could have maybe been a wax doll or something like that. I slowly walked up to her. She didn't even seem to breathe. As I got close to her face to get a better look, her eyes suddenly snapped open. This startled me so much that I fell back on my rear. The woman's face was of pure hate. Her eyes were beady yellow dots set in wrinkled skin with chipped, crooked teeth. The lady looked at me and began to scream. "You trash! This is hell! I'm in hell! Get out!" I had never been more scared in my entire life. I just looked at the woman and screamed my head off. The woman began to scream cries of pain and agony. She clawed at her face, tearing away skin as she yelled, "Let me out! Set me free!" By this time, I had turned to see how Zach was reacting to this, only to see that he had decided to book it and leave. I decided that that wasn't such a bad idea. I ran up the stairs and out of the cellar, the old woman's scream still piercing my thoughts. I raced down the hallway back to the lobby. As I reached the lobby, I came to see Zach pounding on the front door. Somehow, it had been shut and locked. We both began to kick at the door, trying to force it open. We could hear the old woman coming up the stairs of the cellar, coming for us. Her voice was somehow distorted. It was no longer high-pitched and piercing, but low and guttural, the sound of pure evil. We could hear her shouting, "I'm going to drag you to hell with me. You will burn." Zach and I both looked down to the end of the hallway to where the stairs to the cellar were. Her eyes seemed to glow. She suddenly started for us with a speed I had never seen before. With all the strength Zach and I had, we forced the front door open and spilled out into the daylight. We ran that 2-hour hike all the way back to Zach's house without stopping once. I didn't sleep for 2 weeks, and I didn't go back to Llano for 4 months. Months later, Zach and I asked his brother Dave why he said the house was haunted. Dave told us that he and a friend had gone in there and found an old woman wandering the halls, weeping. They had booked it out of there. I still haven't gone back to that house, and I don't plan to. Zach and his dad heard shrieks coming from up the mountain, cries of pain, cries of agony, cries of death. It was creepy as hell.
So I've never posted here before, but I figured I might as well share this story with you guys, since it popped up between a friend of mine and I today. Before I start, you need to know I'm a huge skeptic. I love paranormal shit, but I just don't believe anything. I really don't. Even my own things, I just have to look doubtfully at them until I can prove they happened. Anyway, with that said, I'm going to continue my story. I was 6 years old. We just moved from California to Michigan and had settled in this brand new house. It was really pretty, but in an incredibly old neighborhood. The area was old and people had been living there for ages, but the real estate was all brand new because everything had been torn down in the area after a bunch of big families went broke. Now, I've always had a pretty avid imagination. I read a lot of books as a kid and still do. Fantasy fiction is a big part of my life, and as a result, I was always scurrying around looking for little creatures. I never believed I'd really run into something, but it was fun to look and pretend I would. Come past a few years and I'm 9. I've lived in the house for 3 years and nothing really odd has happened. I mean, I guess not. My mom's heard weird noises in the night and she's woken up a few times swearing up and down that she heard someone crashing down the stairs, but we never find anything to support her claims, so we just kind of dealt with it. But something happened that did put me on edge and creeped me out a little bit. When I came home one day, I was fighting with my sister. She was 3 years younger than me, and at the time I was just being a little shit. We made our way to her room, and I remember glancing at her chalkboard. I blinked, frowned, and ended up asking her, "Hey, Sage, did you write this?" This is where things started to just go downhill. All over the board, the phrase, "I was Johnny," was literally smeared in chalk. Nothing fancy, just hundreds and hundreds of times in a tiny amount of space with next to no chalk left to be used. There were only small nubs left on the little platform that she used to hold her sticks, and even those were basically just crumbs. She vehemently denied ever touching that board. She's 20 now, and still denies it to this day. At the time, I remember just being terrified that someone might have broken in, and when I turned around and noticed the door to my mom's room slowly shutting, I grabbed my sister's hand and bolted to the neighbor's house to call my parents from their work. Later, they brought a police officer over and he inspected the house. He couldn't find anything though, so he ended up leaving a little miffed and obviously annoyed that his time had been wasted. I was embarrassed, but we showed the chalkboard to my mom and she was just as confused as we were. In the end though, she chalked it up to just my sister lying and went about her night. Nothing happened for a while. We had semi-peaceful nights, things stayed average for a few months, and then, well, /x/ what I'm about to tell you is weird. It's weird in that it's not like most stories where I can sit there and tell you, yes, this happened, or no, this didn't happen. Which is why I'm terrified of the memory. I can't tell what it was. I can't tell what the whole scenario is or why it occurred or anything about it. It's a hole in my mind, and no matter how deep I dig to fill it, it doesn't return. I woke up in the middle of the night. My bedroom was in the basement, nestled in a little corner where I had a nice little area all to myself. I remember stumbling up the stairs and into the kitchen, yawning and making myself a glass of water. As I stood there in the dark, rubbing my eyes and sipping on my little cup, I felt something against the back of my neck. It was the strangest sensation, a prickling sensation like spindly fingers gently tapping their way up your spine and along the base of your skull. Little me turned around and stared into the living room where I had felt the sensation coming from. I didn't understand at the time, but I felt a dull ball of horror suddenly form in the pit of my stomach. I saw nothing, but I felt it. I felt something peering back into me from the reflection of the window. I saw nothing looking back, but I felt a gaze opening me up and bringing something out of me. It wasn't healthy. It made me feel sick. I dropped my cup and, as any little kid would, began to hurriedly climb the stairs to my mother and father's room. When I reached the hallway, I felt the overwhelming terror slowly slip away. Out of range of the window, it seemed that whatever it was I felt was gone. Or rather, that whatever had caused me to feel that way was gone. I made my way to my parents' room and gripped the handle. It felt as though the metal had been turned to ice. Ignoring it, or perhaps not even noticing it, I opened the door and felt every single emotion in my body come to a perfect standstill. The room itself was cast in thick shadows. There was nothing to behold in the first moment until my eyes adjusted from the dim nightlight that had previously guided my way through the hallway. And then I saw it. The creature was half hovering over the bed, half concealed by the side of the mattress facing away from my little body. It was dark gray, with a mottled and wrinkly hide of skin that hung around its lithe and skinny body. The arms were long and protruding, with thin fingers draped over the sheets as they were frozen in what seemed to be the action of tracing my mother's face. The head was facing the door the minute I opened it. It had never turned at any point in time, and indeed, it seemed it had been staring long before I even graced it with my presence. The eyes were what did it. Thick, oily, pools of nothingness. There were no orbs set in that gray skull. There was only a sunken gaze that ripped and split open my fragile mind. I felt an extraordinary sound slowly filling my head in the span of at least 30 seconds, similar to the noise of TV static when you can't find the right channel. My eyes had begun to fill with the static as well, and I, trying to force a step forward, to open my mouth to scream and wake up my mother or father, was kept in place by a monolithic force. The noise had transformed from a thin, eerie, high-pitched crackling sound to a roaring thunderstorm in my head. My eyes were transfixed on this ghastly thing as it wouldn't let me out of its stare. A thin mouth peeled open and the creature seemed to smile a horribly red smile for a split second. My vision snapped into black, and just like that I was gone. From then on, there was a vague period of blackness. I can't remember anything beyond that moment. In fact, it was only several days later, after I had woken up one morning, that I suddenly remembered the entire incident. It didn't feel like a dream. It was so powerful, so fucking vivid, and there had been occurrences before the event that had plagued my family. I told my mother one time and she laughed it off and told me I should write books. I can't explain it, but I feel odd too whenever I remember the event. I get this odd achy sensation in my chest, right beneath my sternum. It fills me slowly the more I think about it and stop right before I think any more might make me puke. And that's my little story for you /X/. I hope you enjoyed it. Any information you might have or ideas would be really appreciated. I've long since moved on from that house, but I'm curious to know if anyone has any theories.
You want to know why I torched my family home 15 years ago? It's because it wasn't right. There was something there. All right, here goes. I moved into the house in September '95. It was a lovely house and a really good deal too. I don't mean stupidly good, just better than I had expected for a dream house. Now back then it was me, my then wife, and our 2 children, Jack, 9, and Millie, 3. The house had a lot of space around it for the kids to play. It was pretty well built. The bits that needed repair weren't serious, and the majority of it I could sort out myself, as I'm reasonably handy when it comes to things like that. Anyway, background out of the way, from a weird point of view, the first 2 years passed by pretty uneventfully, or at least nothing sticks in my memory of anything strange or sinister. The first thing I can remember happening was in May of '97. Millie had just turned 5 about a week before, and I had a couple of days off at this time. She had been playing around the house. She was allowed to play outside, but her mother was very careful and protective, and liked to be able to see her when she was outside. We tried to find Millie for lunch, and she was gone. We searched high and low, inside the house, outside the house, everywhere. We checked with the neighbors, nothing. We ended up ringing the police as we thought someone had taken her. Finally, we heard some chattering that sounded like her late at night, like about midnight. It was coming from the floor. There was a crawl space underneath the house, but it is completely sealed, so I'd never been under there. I was convinced I'd heard her though, so I went outside, managed to pry a section off and crawled under the house. I found her under there, all alone. She smiled at me and asked whether lunch was ready. She had no idea that she had been missing for about 12 hours. She said she had been playing with her new friend for a few minutes. Now I was concerned and scared, sure, but she was 5. I figured she had just been playing, fell asleep, and this was all her imagination. Anyway, from that day, Millie had a new friend. Now I know kids have imaginary friends, but this was different. Not only did she seem inseparable from her friend, but she seemed to know things she shouldn't. And when asked about it, she would say her friend told her. What is even more strange is that she would never give a name to her friend. She said that her friend didn't want us to know his name. Still, on its own it isn't too spooky. Just one of those things that happens with kids, I guess. From August, things began to change. Millie would wake up in the night. I'd hear her walking down the corridor whispering to her friend. Each time I got up to see, she would be there holding hands with nothing, staring into her brother's room. This continued on for about a month or so, until late September or early October. The amount of times I had to get up and put her back to bed was unbelievable. Hell, I almost put a lock on her door to keep her from getting up. Anyway, it just stopped. She didn't get up one night, then the next she didn't either. I'm a very light sleeper. If someone turns over down the hall, it'll wake me up. Or the next. It seemed like it was all over, and I was pretty glad. But on October 5th, I think, I woke up to Millie standing at the foot of the bed. But it wasn't her that made me crap myself. It was the thing next to her. It was just a dark shape. But I have never felt anything so menacing. I shot up and grabbed Millie, and it was gone. I thought I was imagining things. Millie looked so confused, she asked me why I'd woken her up. She had been asleep when she walked into my room, I guess. Right. I'm going to speed this up a little. Things started getting worse pretty quickly. Up until then, I could explain most of it away as tricks of the mind, but we started seeing things through the day, shapes, creatures, people who weren't there. It would sound like a pack of dogs were at the door, howling and banging against it to get in. And then a moment later, there was nothing, and no sign of anything for miles. Things would go missing, doors would slam, things would break. There would be whispering as if someone was right at your ear in an empty room. We all had dreams, weird dreams, but it was what was happening to Jack that was most alarming. Now Millie seemed to not be talking to her friend anymore. When I asked her about it, she had no memory of him at all. It was either that she had fallen out with him and was the best liar I've ever come across, or she genuinely remembered nothing about the friend she'd had the last 5 months. But Jack, well, Jack wasn't Jack. All right. Jack was always a sporty, outdoors kid. If he could be outside, he would be. He was on pretty much every sports team he could get on, even if he wasn't that great at the sport. But after Millie stopped talking to her friend, Jack stopped wanting to leave the house, ever. Well, pretty much ever. He'd wake up tired pretty much every day, go to school, come back, and just stay in his room. I thought he was playing on his computer, but he wasn't. He wasn't playing. He wasn't writing. He wasn't reading. He was just in the room, almost all day, doing nothing. I remember walking past his room a lot and hearing him talking quietly, like Millie used to. A lot of it I could barely make out, but the things that I could were strange ramblings, but definitely sounded like he was talking to someone when no one was there. I was thinking about getting him checked out. Maybe he was having delusions or something. November 1st, I woke up in the middle of the night, with a feeling something was wrong. I couldn't explain it. There wasn't anything in the room, no sound had woken me, nothing. There was just something wrong. My first thought was Jack, after what had been going on the past few weeks. So I got up and went to his room, and I saw it. Standing over his bed was that same figure that I'd convinced myself I had imagined. This thing was huge, 7 feet tall and dark. I wouldn't even call it shadow. Darkness doesn't do it justice, to be honest. It wasn't that it was simply dark, it was like the exact opposite of any light at all. It was like a hole, I suppose, but in the vague shape of a man. It saw me, turned and ran straight through the window. My son had been awake through this, I was sure of it. He had been sitting next to the thing, but when I turned back to him, his eyes were shut, and he was breathing shallowly. He was asleep. The next few nights I set an alarm for midnight to check in on the kids and make sure nothing was going on, and luckily I saw nothing. Jack seemed a little more like his old self. Less tired, he was playing out around the house again. Could that thing have been stopping him from going outside, doing something to him in the night? Now you've got the background, I can take you to the night we left that house, the night before I torched it. It had been pretty quiet for a few days, no weird noises or sights really, but on November 13th everything went insane. The front door was getting knocked on every few minutes, but there was never anyone there. Rooms that were empty for a pretty small amount of time would be trashed when someone went in them. We were all on edge and pretty scared that night, but we went to bed as normal anyway, as you do. That night it changed. Up until then, no one had gotten hurt. This thing seemed to want to be close to the kids sometimes, but it never seemed to want to hurt them. This night, it changed. I woke up to screaming from Millie's room. I rushed in and saw Jack, with eyes that weren't his, holding a knife. He turned to me and told me to get out, but what spoke was not my son. That was not the voice of any living person. I grabbed the knife off my son quickly, cutting myself in the process, threw it away and grabbed my kids. I shouted to my wife to wake her as I took the kids back to my room, but needn't have bothered. She was awake. She was on the bed, looking at the thing I had seen twice. The figure. The dark figure standing above her and snarling down at her. Snarling is a bad word, there wasn't a face. There was a head, but there weren't any features. But this thing, you could tell it was snarling, if that makes any sense. My wife was paralyzed with fear. She told me later that when she woke up due to Millie's scream, it was there. Straight away it was there, and I just hadn't seen it as I'd rushed out to see what was happening with the kids. I don't know how. It was about 4 feet away from where I was laying. I suppose it didn't want me to see it. I grabbed her away from the thing, and it turned to look right at me. It didn't have a mouth, but it talked. In the most unearthly voice I could imagine, it told me to get out. It was the voice that had come from my son in Millie's room. It said to get out and never come back, or we would all die. Now, this wasn't a warning. There was no chance that this was something that was trying to save us from something. This thing was threatening my family, or even promising. I know if I'd have stayed, that something would have happened to us. I got us all into the car and I drove us to a motel. We ended up staying there for a few days before moving in with my wife's parents for a few months. After that, I managed to get a transfer with work, and we moved abroad and never looked back. But the night after we left, I left the kids with my wife at the motel and went back home to deal with the thing that had terrorized my family. I doused the entire thing with as much gas as I could. I had plenty of cans full of it, and used some fertilizer I'd bought a while before as an accelerant. The thing knew what I was doing. It shut the front door tight, but by that point I didn't care. I just couldn't get in. I pierced a can and threw it through a window so it would empty out in the room, and I lit it up. Just as I did, I saw the thing in Jack's room once again, staring at me. Hatred like I've never known was in that eyeless gaze. I left it to burn, and burn it did. I never went back, but a friend of mine did, one who I told the events to and who believed me. He told me that the place was incinerated. He'd never seen something burn down that thoroughly. There wasn't even a shell left, just a bit of a foundation where the crawl space used to be. So I torched the house, hoping it would kill whatever that thing was. I think it wanted the house, or at least us out of the house, but I wanted it gone. I left with my family and never went back after that. Like I said, we left the country altogether. The kids are grown up now and don't remember much of it. Jack remembers Millie having an imaginary friend, but doesn't remember anything from October or November. He doesn't remember the night, and for obvious reasons I've never gone over any of it in much detail before. I'll never go back.
What I am about to tell you is a true story. You can choose to believe it or not. Personally, it freaks me out, but paranormal fans will get a kick out of it. To this day, this is the one thing that makes me believe in the paranormal. It's hard to doubt when you've seen something with your own eyes, after all. About 20 years, from the point where I was 4 until I was nearly 8, I lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment in Alabama. My parents wanted a fresh start when my younger sister was born, so we lived several states away from the rest of our family. This will matter later. In this apartment, when all the lights were off and everyone was asleep, I would regularly see a gray man. It wasn't that his skin was gray or he was wearing a gray suit. It was like he was made of gray light, similar to this picture I found. The gray man would only ever appear in my room, or rather the room I shared with my sister. Most of the time he just paced back and forth, never making a sound. Sometimes I would wake up and he would be standing over me. It never made any noise. It never did anything but pace and stand, but I was still terrified of it. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that I was just scaring myself. That never got rid of it, though. Eventually, we moved, and I forgot about the gray man until one night I was at my grandmother's a few years later. I was about 15, I think. I think the conversation started with something about aliens. I honestly can't recall. We got to talking about paranormal stuff, and I told the story of the gray man. My grandmother thought it was cute and told me he was probably my guardian angel. I wasn't religious, but for about 10 seconds there, I was immensely relieved. At this point, my sister chimed in too, saying she had seen the man. My sister was about 4 years younger than me, so she would have been very young, but we did share the room. The look she gave me took away that brief feeling of relief I had moments before. It was a look of knowing, a look of fear, the look you see in people's faces when they don't want to believe something is true. The next part was worse, though. My uncle, who is only about 2 years older than me, was the one who started this whole conversation, but he had been completely silent when I talked about the gray man. He then proceeded to tell me a story about how once when he was visiting, he woke up in the middle of the night to get some water. When he got back to the room, he saw a gray man standing near my bed. He said after he saw him, he ran into the living room and didn't look back. The thing about that little apartment we had was that it was so far from the rest of the family. I remember every visit we ever got. I remembered that visit. I remembered my uncle going to sleep in our bedroom. I remember waking him up in the living room the next morning. I remember the broken glass in the hallway where the floor was wet. I remember asking him why he was in the living room if he went to sleep in the bedroom. I remember the look on his face that I didn't understand as a child. That look was fear. On that night, my uncle, my sister, and myself all realized that whatever the gray man was, it wasn't imaginary. Whether it was an angel, a ghost, or something else, it was real. About 4 years ago, I saw the gray man one more time. I wasn't sure of it until tonight. My parents were off on some trip, so I was staying at their place. I was taking care of my kid brother and some pets. It was late, and I was playing video games. I got up to go to the bathroom when I saw him in the hallway. He disappeared immediately. At first, I was terrified, But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was probably my imagination or some trick with my eyes. I had never seen the gray man disappear before, not to mention I was sleep-deprived, had just been playing video games in a room with no lights on, and most importantly, I was nowhere near that old apartment. I went on towards the bathroom, but I stopped to look in on my brother on the way. I realize now that the gray man was right outside his bedroom that night. Fast forward to tonight. The end of our story, and the reason I am telling you all this. My parents are both drug addicts who have hit rock bottom, so my kid brother lives with me now. I only have a small one-bedroom apartment, so he sleeps in the living room. I was thirsty, so I left my room for a drink. As soon as I made the left out of my room into the living room, I saw him. He was standing over my brother, who was sleeping on the couch. He immediately turned around and looked at me before he vanished. He was exactly as I remembered, tall, gray, and almost made of light, if that makes any sense. He had no face, but I felt something when I saw his not face. I was terrified, of course, but for a moment I felt like he was too. Whatever he is, and whatever its purpose is, it's in my house now, and I don't know what to do. That's it, folks.
If it wants and could harm you, it would have already done so, I guess. So it doesn't seem like it is hostile. I would try making contact, saying a simple hello, and look at what the figure does. Maybe it's just curious about you for some reason. Maybe it's really a guardian angel. Who knows? I was 8 years old. I remember waking up in my parents' bed. I must have fell asleep on the couch downstairs and been carried up to bed. But all I remember is laying there alone. The hall light was on, and I heard the TV downstairs. So I thought my parents were still down there watching TV. So I enjoyed the huge bed to myself, their heavy, thick duvet covering me. Freshly made bed I could stretch out in, but there was a lump in the bed next to me, and it shifted a bit as I stretched out. I remember it moving. I just thought it was the dog. So I moved my little toes towards it under the covers, but when they reached the lump, it was nothing but cold, like ice against the sole of my foot. I snatched it back quickly. Whatever was making the lump in the bed slid off the other side. I heard nothing, but felt the cover being pulled as it moved, and I was frozen. What was in the bed with me? And does it know I'm aware? I lay there for an eternity, ears open and my breathing light, trying to hear whatever it was on the floor, or was it under the bed? Was it waiting for me to move? I was so quiet. I could hear the TV clearly now. There was no show on, just a high-pitched ringing. The TV channel had ended for the night. So why were my parents not in bed? I sat up in bed, slowly, quietly, trying to disturb the huge bed as little as possible. I pulled the covers away so I could make the jump from the bed to the light of the hall. I could run downstairs and get my parents. I could make it, so I stood on the bed. And I jumped. I ran so fast down the stairs. I ran into the living room and I saw them. My parents were frozen, staring at the TV, eyes open, mouths open, frozen still, and I could feel it behind me, at the top of the stairs, looking at me. I turned around and all I could see was its huge black glass eyes. All I could hear was the TV. When I woke up, I was outside my house. My parents thought I was sleepwalking. They don't remember putting me to bed, though.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check the Odyssey and Rumble pages for separate archives of previous broadcasts.